Once upon a time, a long, long, long time ago, in China, there lived an emperor. An emperor who lived in a beautiful, exquisite palace. It was so beautiful. Every single part of it was made of porcelain. Porcelain. And so, as you walked through the palace, you could hear your footsteps on the ground. It was covered in gold and jewels and crystals. And in the great throne room was a huge golden throne, which the emperor liked to sit on. Surrounding the palace was the most beautiful gardens, lush green grass, and every single flower. The flowers smelt so sweet, and the colours were so vibrant that it was said that they could cure anything. And the emperor had ordered that on each flower would hang a small silver bell. And so as visitors were walking through the gardens, the wind would blow across the silver bells, and they would remember to look up and make sure they did not miss any of the beautiful sights around them. There was simple, beautiful pagodas. And if you kept walking through the gardens, which could take a very, very long time, you would come to crystal clear lakes. And if you continued down through the crystal clear lakes, you would come to dark, luscious forest with great trees, with roots that grew down and down and down, as if they would reach the core of the earth, and branches that grew up and up and up and up, as if they would reach heaven themselves. And if you carried on through the forest, you would come to the crystal blue sea. The sea which would come almost up to the forest itself. And there, by the sea, was a small hut where old fishermen lived. Every morning, the fisherman would take his nets, and he would sit and he would mend his nets, and he would go out and fish. And in the evening, the moon would come out, silver, shining in the sky. And the fisherman would stop, for he could hear a sound. tree lived a small brown bird, a nightingale. A nightingale. Now, nightingales have the sweetest, most beautiful voices. Indeed, sometimes, even now, you can hear the nightingale in the forest. And so the fisherman would stop and listen to the nightingale's song. The fisherman was not the only person who would hear the nightingale's song. People came from all around the world to see the empire, to see the gardens, the lakes, the forest. And they would write in books about the beautiful things they'd seen. But more than anything else, they would write about the nightingale, the small brown bird. Now it happened that the emperor received one of these books. It was the morning, and the emperor was sitting on his golden throne, looking out at his palace, when there was a knock, knock, knock on the palace door. There was the Chancellor. The Chancellor, the Emperor's most trusted advisor. And in his hand was a parcel. A present from the Emperor of Japan. The Emperor opened the present, and there was a book. It is a book about my very own palace and my grounds. And so the Emperor would read through. He would see how the writer had talked about the beautiful flowers with the bells on them. And there is the lake. And indeed, the forest is the most beautiful, lush forest. Indeed, I have had every tree planted there by my ancestor's ancestor. Yes. And the Emperor was very pleased to see all his beautiful things written in the book. Yes, indeed. Until he came to an entry he did not recognise. Nightingale? I have never heard of a nightingale, and certainly not in my lands. And yet it says that this has the most beautiful voice. Indeed, the nightingale is said to be the jewel of this land. The Emperor slammed the book shut, and he clapped his hands. Nightingale to me." "Nightingale?" said the advisor. "Nightingale?" He looked at the book. "Huh! I have never heard of the nightingale." "Well, you must bring the nightingale to me," said the emperor, "and quickly." And so the advisor went pitter-patter, 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 all across all the porcelain floors, running up and down. But no one had heard of the nightingale. So he went up all the floors of the palace, higher and higher and higher. But no one had heard of the nightingale. He asked the scholars. He asked all the courtiers. But no one had heard of the nightingale. And so he ran back down the steps. "The nightingale is a myth," he announced. "No one in the palace has heard of the nightingale. You can't trust everything you read in the news and in books, you know." Said the emperor. He was not happy. "But it says in the book, and the book has been sent to me by the Emperor of Japan himself. No, I will see the nightingale, and I will hear the nightingale, and you shall get me the nightingale. And if you don't—" The emperor thought for a moment. He scratched his head. He had a terrible punishment. "If you don't bring me the nightingale, then I will have everybody punched in their tummy after supper." This was a terrible punishment. And so this time the advisor went running up and down over the porcelain steps. But now it wasn't just the advisor, it was the whole of the palace, for no one wanted to be punched in the stomach after supper. But no one had heard of the nightingale. The advisor was beginning to worry. And then he came to the last room of the palace. He knocked on the door. There was the kitchen of the palace. The cook was there. No, I have never heard of the nightingale. Just then, the young servant girl, the kitchen helper, came in. "Of course I've heard of the nightingale," she said. "The little brown bird. The little brown bird who sings in the tree by my grandfather's hut. He's a fisherman, you see, and sometimes when I go and stay there, I hear the sound of the nightingale." And she thought about it to herself. Well, you must come with us, said the advisor, and he clapped his hands, and suddenly they were in front of the emperor, off to find the nightingale. They walked out of the palace, out into the grounds. There was the gardens with the beautiful scented, colourful flowers. They could hear the sound of the bells. One bell attached to each flower, so that no one would miss the beauty in the world. They continued past the flowers, past the pagodas, to the clear, beautiful lakes. They looked into the beautiful lakes and they could see their own reflections in the lakes. And then they heard a sound. Moo, 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 moo. Said the royal advisor, we have found the nightingale. It has perhaps a familiar sound. A familiar sound, like almost a deeper sound than I imagined the nightingale to have. But it must be the nightingale. Oh, it is perhaps a little bigger than the nightingale. The young servant girl could hardly contain her laughter. You see, sire, this is, well, you know as well as I do. For the creature in front of them was not a nightingale, for it went moo, 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 moo. For it was a cow. In fact, a herd of cows. And so they continued on their way. They next came to the ponds of the palace, a pond in a clearing of the green, lush forest. Ribbit, 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 ribbit. Said the royal advisor. We have found the nightingale. It has a little bit of a higher voice. And perhaps it is a little familiar. But it must be the nightingale. Oh dear. The young servant girl could hardly hold in her giggles. Her tummy was hurting. This is not the nightingale, she said, for she knows as well as you do. It was some frogs singing their frog song. Ribbit, 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 ribbit. Said the advisor. I knew that. And so they carried on through the forest. It felt like they had been walking for hours until they came to a tree by the crystal blue sea. And there they heard a sound. advisor was silent. They looked up into the branches, and there was the small brown bird. "This is our nightingale," said the girl. Dear Nightingale, will you come and sing for the emperor?" "It would be my honour," said the nightingale. And so the nightingale followed the royal advisor and the girl to the palace. In through to the throne room walked the royal advisor, the young girl, and flew in the nightingale. There was the emperor sitting on his golden throne, and already set up was a golden jewelled perch. To the corner was a golden cage. The nightingale flew over to the perch, sat, and began to sing her song. When she had finished, she looked over to the emperor. The emperor had been crying, and a single tear fell down his cheek. "What can I give you in return for this beautiful song?" asked the emperor of the nightingale. "You don't need to give me anything," she said, "for I have seen an emperor's tears, and this is the most precious thing." But the emperor really did not understand this, and so he presented the nightingale with that golden gilt cage. It was indeed very beautiful, but it was not the forest she had come from. And every day she would call and she would sing her song for the emperor and those in the palace and those who came from miles around, all over the world. And it wasn't as if she didn't go outside anymore. But the emperor really didn't understand. And so the emperor gave the nightingale 12 advisors, 12 guides, who would take the nightingale out for a walk. And so each of the guides would hold a ribbon, and the ribbon was tied to the nightingale's leg. And this was the way she took her walk round the grounds of the palace. And yet, somehow, the nightingale still sung. And more books arrived for the emperor, talking not just now about the palace and the gardens, but the nightingale in her gilt cage. And people would come from miles around to hear her beautiful song. One day there was a knock on the palace door. There was a parcel. Now the emperor loved presents. Perhaps it's another book about my nightingale, he said to himself. He took the parcel. He shook it a little. It didn't feel like a book. He peeked in. He could hardly believe his eyes, for out of the parcel came, well, another nightingale. The nightingale, but this one, it was not brown and feathery. It was a clockwork nightingale. It was gold and silver with rubies for eyes, with gems, sapphires encrusted into it. It was indeed the most beautiful thing the emperor had ever seen. And at the back of the nightingale there was a turn, and as he turned it, he wound up the nightingale, and it began to sing. It was indeed quite beautiful, but, well, I'll leave it to you. When he turned it again, it played the same thing again. It was really the most incredible thing. And so he kept on turning the nightingale again and again and again and again, until he finally remembered the real nightingale sitting on her perch. "We must have a duet," declared the emperor. And so he tried, but the sound was not good. "Indeed, they are tuned differently," said the emperor to himself. "No matter. The mechanical nightingale, it does not get tired like the real nightingale." And so he turned it again and again and again. And everybody in the palace came to see and hear this incredible nightingale, and to ooh and ah at the gold and the jewels and the crystals around it. And so it went on. The emperor turned the mechanical nightingale 100 times. And then he paused. He looked over to the golden perch. "Come!" he shouted to the nightingale. But she had already flown away out of the window, back to her tree. The emperor was sad. But he looked, and as his adviser reminded him, he still had the best nightingale, the most wonderful nightingale, and the most golden nightingale. The best nightingale. And so he just turned the handle, and the nightingale continued to sing. And on and on and on. And there was something wonderful, to a certain extent, about the mechanical nightingale. For the mechanical nightingale did not need walks and did not need food. And they could always predict the song the nightingale would sing. And so it went on, day after day, month after month, year after year, until one day the emperor was taken ill. He was taken to his bed, and it was known he was very, very poorly. The royal adviser put down blankets and sheets on the porcelain floor, so as the people walked through the palace, they would not disturb the emperor. The emperor lay in his bed. He tried to sleep. And as he slept, he went into a strange, fearful dream. He was seeing around him the most dreadful shadows, a nightmare here and there and everywhere. And he would call out. He called out for his nightingale. And so the royal adviser would come and turn the nightingale, and the nightingale would begin to sing. And the emperor could relax. He would sleep soundly that night. One night, when he was having those terrible nightmares, he called his royal adviser to turn the key of the mechanical nightingale. But not a sound came out. He turned it again and again, but there was no use. he called for the doctor. He called for the doctor. Come, 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 fix the nightingale. Make him well again. Well, you know as well as I do that you don't have a doctor to fix a mechanical nightingale. And so the doctor put on his stethoscope and he checked the nightingale. This is not a job for a doctor, he said. Perhaps a priest. And so he called the priest. The priest examined the nightingale. There's nothing I can do, he said. Perhaps call the watchmaker. So the emperor called the watchmaker. The watchmaker put on his eyeglass. He took his tools. And it took all night. And he presented the nightingale to the emperor. But, he said, the nightingale is now very old, and so you must use it very sparingly. And so the nightingale sang no longer. The emperor was so scared to let the nightingale play that he would leave it silent. The days went on, and the months went on, and the years went on, until once again the emperor was called to his bed. The blankets were set out across the floor, covering up the sound of the porcelain. And once again the emperor was in his fitful sleep. This time those shadows were darker and deeper still. And so the emperor reached out to the mechanical nightingale. He tried to turn it, and it began to sing. He began to relax, and those shadows began to disappear. But then the nightingale stopped. He turned the key behind the nightingale again and again and again, and the springs fell out of the nightingale. It had gone. The emperor fell back into that fitful sleep, and now he saw those shadows becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and he was terrified. He called out, "Nightingale!" He remembered in his brain, he remembered in his mind the beautiful brown nightingale who had sung for him most sweetly. "Nightingale!" he called out. "Nightingale! If you can hear me, come and sing for me one more time." And then he fell into that deep, deep nightmare sleep. The shadows around him grew bigger and bigger. Perhaps it was all in his head. for he could swear he could hear the nightingale. His nightingale who had sung for him. He listened. And as he listened, he became aware that it was becoming lighter. Those shadows, those figures of his nightmares were beginning to melt away. They floated up and out of the window, out into the light of the moon. And there, singing in front of him, was his beloved nightingale, that small brown bird, singing and singing and singing. And he felt his strength coming back to him. He felt his hope and his joy. And the nightingale came and landed in his hands. "What can I give you in return?" said the emperor. "You gave me your jewel. You gave me the tears. That is more than enough for me," said the nightingale. "And you can give me one more thing," said the emperor. "Will you come and sing for me again? Will you come and live in the palace? I have been miserable since you have gone." A palace and a golden perch and a golden cage is not a place for a nightingale. I have to fly. I have to fly in the sky. I have to be in nature, she said. "But I will come and sing at your window. And I will sing to you of the beauty of the world. I will sing to you of the joy of those who live in the lands that you govern. But I will also sing to you of the sadness of those who govern. And so that you will know the news, you will know what is happening in these lands. And so, but you must make sure you never tell anybody, for who would believe that you would receive wisdom from a nightingale?" And so from that day on, that's exactly what happened. Each evening, when the emperor retired to bed, he would look out of the window, and there would be the nightingale sitting in a tree by the palace, singing and singing of the beauty in the world, of the sadness in the world, of the courage in the world, and the joy in the world, and the wisdom in the world. And it is said that the emperor became the most wise, most beautifully, most wonderful ruler. And it is said that you could hear the nightingale singing back and forth across the lands, singing for the fishermen, singing for those in the palace, and singing for each of us. And it was all written down in a book and a story that I have told for you today. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your evening and day. The story I just told you was The Emperor's Nightingale by Hans Christian Andersen. Happy playing.